A millionaire receives the heartbreaking news of his son's death and instantly suffers a heart attack. When all seems lost, a little 6-year-old beggar takes his hand and pleads, "Please don't die." What happens next brought everyone present to tears and will surely surprise you. Watch this beautiful story of overcoming adversity until the very end. If this story interested you, subscribe to our channel, don't forget to like this video, and tell us which city you're watching us from. We'll keep going. The late autumn. Wind whipped through Manhattan's concrete canyons as Maxwell Reed stood at his office window on the 52nd floor. At 63, he had everything money could buy, except what mattered most. The emptiness in his chest had grown deeper since Sarah's death 5 years ago, and now, staring at the city lights blurring through his tears, he could barely breathe. His secretary's voice crackled through the intercom. "Mr. Reed, the board meeting starts in 10 minutes. Maxwell adjusted his silk tie, trying to steady his trembling hands. The merger documents lay untouched on his mahogany desk, but he couldn't focus on them. Today would have been Sarah's birthday. His wife had been the only one who understood him, who could calm his troubled mind. Without her, the world seemed colorless, meaningless. The pain in his left arm had been growing worse all morning. He'd ignored it, like he ignored most things that couldn't be solved with money or power. But now, as he reached for his briefcase, the discomfort exploded into agony that radiated across his chest. Maxwell stumbled, knocking over a crystal vase. Water and roses scattered across the Persian carpet as he clutched his chest, gasping for air. The city lights outside began to swim and blur. He tried to reach the intercom, but his legs wouldn't cooperate. The floor rushed up to meet him as darkness crept into the edges of his vision. Through the haze of pain, he heard the office door open. Expecting his secretary, he was surprised to see a small figure instead. A little girl, no more than 6 or 7, wearing a tattered coat, several sizes too big. Her dark eyes were wide with concern as she rushed to his side. "Mister, are you okay?" Her voice was high and clear, cutting through his pain-filled fog. "Please don't die." Maxwell tried to speak, but could only manage a weak groan. The girl grabbed his hand, her small fingers surprisingly warm against his clammy skin. "Stay with me, please, I'll get help." He wanted to tell her to leave, that this was no place for a child, but the pain was overwhelming. Through his fading consciousness, he watched as she ran to his desk and pressed the intercom button. "Help! Please help! The man is very sick." Her voice carried the urgency that his couldn't. The last thing Maxwell saw before losing consciousness was the girl's face hovering over his, her eyes filled with tears. "Don't die, mister. Please don't die." When he awoke in the hospital hours later, the steady beep of monitors filling his private room, his first thought was of the little girl. His secretary, Helen, sat in a chair nearby, her usually impeccable appearance showing signs of stress. "The girl," he croaked, his throat dry. "Where is she?" Helen leaned forward. "She disappeared before security could talk to her. Nobody knows how she got into the building." She paused, then added softly, "The doctors said if she hadn't called for help when she did, you wouldn't have survived." Maxwell closed his eyes, remembering the warmth of her small hand in his. In all his years of wealth and success, no one had shown him such pure, unconditional concern. Who was she? How had she gotten into his office? And why did she care whether he lived or died? The questions swirled in his mind as exhaustion pulled him back toward sleep. But one thing was certain. He needed to find her. Not just to thank her, but because something about her reminded him of the humanity he'd lost along his climb to success. Little did he know, this encounter would change not only his life, but would unravel secrets that had been buried for decades. The girl's appearance in his office that day was no accident, and her connection to his past would shake the very foundation of everything he believed about himself and his carefully constructed world. 2 weeks after his heart attack, Maxwell was released from the hospital. His doctors had warned him to take it easy, but his mind was consumed with finding the mysterious little girl. He'd hired private investigators, reviewed security footage, and questioned every employee in the building, but no one could explain how she had appeared in his office that day. The autumn chill had deepened as his driver James steered the Mercedes through the city streets. Maxwell watched the passing crowds, studying every child's face, hoping to glimpse those dark eyes that had pleaded with him to "Lasive." "Stop the car," Maxwell suddenly commanded. There, huddled in a doorway of a closed shop, was a small figure in an oversized coat. James pulled over, but by the time Maxwell got out, she was gone. "Sir, you should be resting," James said, concern evident in his voice. Maxwell ignored him, walking down the sidewalk despite the protest in his chest. The coat, he was sure it was the same one. He followed the narrow alley where he'd seen her disappear, emerging onto a quieter street lined with aging brownstones. A woman was sweeping the steps of one of the buildings. She looked up as Maxwell approached, her weathered face creasing with worry. "Can I help you?" "I'm looking for a little girl," Maxwell said, realizing how strange he must look in his expensive suit. About 6 years old, dark eyes, wearing a brown coat too big for her. The woman's expression hardened. "Why are you looking for her?" Something in her tone made Maxwell pause. "She helped me when I was ill. I want to thank her." The woman studied him for a long moment. "That would be Lucy," she finally said. "She's my granddaughter, or was." Her voice caught. "She's very sick." Maxwell's heart skipped a beat. "Where is she? Please, I need to see her." "Metropolitan Hospital," the woman replied, her eyes filling with tears. "Children's ward, but visiting hours are almost over." Maxwell was already walking back to his car, pulling out his phone. "Helen, contact Metropolitan Hospital. I need to speak to the Chief of Staff immediately." An hour later, Maxwell stood in the doorway of a hospital room, his heart breaking at the sight before him. Lucy lay in a bed too big for her tiny frame, tubes and wires connecting her to various machines. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her dark eyes seemed too large for her thin face. She turned her head as he entered, and a weak smile lit up her features. "You didn't die," she whispered. Maxwell moved to her bedside, taking her small hand in his. "No, thanks to you. But why were you in my office that day?" Lucy's smile faded. "I was looking for someone. The nurses said I shouldn't leave my room, but I had to find them before—" She trailed off, her eyes growing distant. "Find who?" Maxwell asked gently. "My family," she replied. "Grandma said my real mom worked in your building a long time ago, before she died." Lucy's voice was growing weaker. "I thought maybe if I found where she worked, I could find my dad. Grandma doesn't know who he is." Maxwell felt a chill run down his spine. 25 years ago, when his company was just beginning to grow, there had been someone, a brief relationship he'd ended when things became too complicated. She'd tried to tell him something important, but he'd been too focused on his ambitions to listen. "What was your mother's name?" he asked, his mouth dry. "Rachel," Lucy whispered. "Rachel Thompson." The room seemed to spin as Maxwell sank into the chair beside her bed. Rachel, the only woman besides Sarah who had ever made him question his priorities, the woman who had disappeared without a trace, leaving only a letter he'd never opened, a letter that still sat, unopened, in the bottom drawer of his desk. As Lucy drifted off to sleep, her small hand still clutching his, Maxwell faced the terrifying possibility that his past had finally caught up with him, and the little girl who had saved his life might be the key to his redemption or his ultimate undoing. Maxwell sat in his home office late that night, the still sealed envelope from Rachel trembling in his hands. The paper had yellowed with age, but her elegant handwriting remained clear on the front. He'd kept it all these years, unable to throw it away, yet too afraid to read its contents. Outside, rain pelted against the windows of his penthouse apartment, matching his turbulent thoughts. Lucy's face haunted him, those dark eyes so similar to Rachel's, the determined set of her jaw that mirrored his own. Could it be possible? Had his single-minded pursuit of success cost him more than he'd ever imagined? The door chime interrupted his thoughts. At this hour, it could only be Helen. She entered carrying a thick folder and wearing an expression that confirmed his worst fears. "I found her birth certificate," Helen said quietly, placing the folder on his desk. Lucy Thompson, born at Mount Sinai Hospital. Mother, Rachel Thompson. She paused, her voice softening. Father, unknown. Maxwell opened the folder with shaking hands. Lucy's medical records painted a grim picture. Acute lymphoblastic leukemia, diagnosed 6 months ago. Traditional treatments had failed, and her condition was deteriorating rapidly. She needed a bone marrow transplant, but no matching donors had been found. There's more, Helen continued. Rachel died in a car accident when Lucy was just a baby. Her grandmother, Margaret Thompson, has been raising her alone. They've struggled financially, the medical bills. Take care of them, Maxwell interrupted, all of them, and arrange for the best specialists to review her case. Helen nodded but didn't leave. Max, she said gently, using his first name for the first time in 20 years of working together. You need to read the letter. He knew she was right. With trembling fingers, he broke the seal and unfolded the pages inside. Rachel's words, written 25 years ago, leaped off the page. Dear Max, by the time you read this, I'll be gone from New York. I've tried to tell you in person, but you're always too busy, too focused on your next big deal. I'm pregnant, Max. The baby is yours. Maxwell's vision blurred as he read on. Rachel had written about her hopes, her fears, her understanding of his ambition, but her unwillingness to raise their child in its shadow. She'd asked for nothing, no money, no recognition, just the truth whenever he was ready to hear it. He never had been ready, until now. A knock on his office door startled him. Dr. Wilson, Lucy's oncologist, entered with a grave expression. Mr. Reed, I have her latest test results. Maxwell steeled himself. How bad is it? Without a matching donor, she has weeks at most. Maybe less. The doctor hesitated. Given the circumstances, I took the liberty of running a preliminary comparison with your blood type and genetic markers. Maxwell held his breath. You're a match, Mr. Reed, a perfect match. Dr. Wilson's eyes were kind but serious. Which, given the genetic markers involved, confirms what I suspect you've just learned. Lucy is your daughter. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. All these years, he'd had a daughter who was now fighting for her life in a hospital bed, who had somehow found her way to his office just in time to save him, and now perhaps he could save her. But as Maxwell reached for his phone to set things in motion, it rang first. The hospital's number flashed on the screen. Mr. Reed, a nurse's urgent voice came through. You need to come quickly. Lucy's taken a turn for the worse. Maxwell was already running for the door, the letter clutched in his hand, his heart pounding with a fear greater than any he'd felt during his own brush with death. He couldn't lose her. Not now. Not when he'd only just found her. What he didn't know was that the night's revelations were only the beginning. Lucy's condition would lead him down a path that would uncover even more painful truths, ones that would force him to confront not only his past choices, but also the very foundations of his success. The children's ward was eerily quiet when Maxwell arrived, out of breath and soaked from the rain. Margaret Thompson stood outside Lucy's room, her face drawn with worry. She straightened when she saw him, recognition and something else, anger perhaps, flashing in her eyes. So now you know, she said quietly. After all these years. I just read Rachel's letter, Maxwell replied, his voice raw. I had no idea, please believe me. Margaret's expression softened slightly. Rachel believed you would come find us when you were ready. She never lost faith in you, even at the end. She wiped a tear. Lucy's just like her that way, always believing in people. Before Maxwell could respond, alarms began blaring from Lucy's room. Medical staff rushed past them, and through the doorway Maxwell caught glimpses of his daughter's small form as doctors worked over her. Her fever's spiking, a nurse called out. Blood pressure dropping. Margaret grabbed Maxwell's arm, her fingers digging in. They watched helplessly as the medical team fought to stabilize Lucy. After what seemed like hours but was probably only minutes, Dr. Wilson emerged, looking exhausted. We've managed to bring her fever down, he said, but she's very weak. The infection we've been fighting has spread. We need to start the transplant process immediately if we want to have any chance. Then let's do it, Maxwell said. Whatever it takes. Dr. Wilson shook his head. It's not that simple. Given your recent heart attack, you're at high risk for complications. The donation process is intensive. It could trigger another cardiac event. I don't care, Maxwell insisted. She's my daughter. And what good will you be to her if you die trying? To save her? Margaret's voice was sharp. She's already lost one parent. She doesn't need to lose another. The words hit Maxwell like a physical blow. He looked through the window at Lucy, so small and pale in her hospital bed. She'd saved his life without a thought for her own safety. How could he do any less for her? There has to be a way, he said, some kind of compromise. Dr. Wilson considered for a moment. There's a new procedure being developed at Johns Hopkins. It's less invasive with lower risks for the donor. But he hesitated. But what? It's experimental. Insurance won't cover it and the cost is substantial. Maxwell almost laughed. Money. For once, that was the least of his problems. Make it happen, whatever it costs. As Dr. Wilson hurried off to make arrangements, Maxwell turned to Margaret. May I sit with her? She nodded but caught his arm as he moved toward the door. She's been asking for something. A photo she saw in your office of a garden with roses. She said it looked like something from a fairy tale. Maxwell's throat tightened. The photo was of Sarah's garden at their summer house in Connecticut, where she'd spent countless hours tending her beloved roses. After her death, he'd closed up the house, unable to bear the memories it held. I know that place, he said softly. It was my late wife's garden. Lucy has this dream, Margaret continued. She says when she gets better, she wants to visit a garden like that, to smell the roses and feel the sun on her face. Her voice broke. I've never been able to give her anything so beautiful. Maxwell entered Lucy's room, pulling a chair close to her bed. Her eyes fluttered open at his approach, and a faint smile touched her lips. You came back, she whispered. Of course I did. He took her small hand in his. Lucy, there's something I need to tell you, something about your mother and about me. But before he could continue, Lucy's eyes closed and her hand went limp in his. The monitors started screaming once again, and Maxwell found himself being pushed aside as medical staff rushed back in. This time, as he watched them working to save his daughter's life, Maxwell made a silent promise. If Lucy survived, he would give her not just a garden, but a home filled with all the love and beauty she deserved. He just needed time to make things right, to become the father she needed. Time that, with each passing moment, seemed to be running out. Days blurred together as Maxwell divided his time between the hospital and endless medical consultations. The procedure at Johns Hopkins offered hope, but Lucy's condition continued to deteriorate. She slept more now, her small body fighting battles that no child should have to face. One rainy afternoon, as Maxwell sat beside her bed reviewing medical documents, Lucy stirred and opened her eyes. Tell me about the garden, she whispered. The one in the picture. Maxwell set aside his papers. It was my wife Sarah's garden. She spent years creating it, planting every rose bush herself. His voice grew soft with memory. There were pathways, winding through the flowers, and a little fountain in the center. In the summer, butterflies would dance around the blooms. Lucy's eyes brightened slightly. What color were the roses? Every color you can imagine. Red ones like rubies, pink ones soft as sunrise, white ones pure as snow. Sarah had a special touch. She could make anything grow. Do you still go there? Maxwell's heart clenched. No, sweetheart. I closed up the house after Sarah died. It was too painful. Lucy was quiet for a moment, her fingers playing with the edge of her blanket. That's sad, she finally said. Gardens shouldn't be lonely. Before Maxwell could respond, Margaret entered with a small paper bag that filled the room with a warm, familiar scent. I brought your favorite, she said to Lucy. Fresh cinnamon rolls from Mrs. Chen's bakery. Lucy managed a weak smile. Will you share them? She asked, looking at Maxwell. He started to decline, but something in her expression stopped him. When was the last time he'd shared a simple meal with anyone? I'd love to, Margaret pulled up another chair and carefully broke a warm roll into small pieces for Lucy. The three of them sat together, eating in companionable silence as rain tapped against the windows. "Tell Grandma about the garden," Lucy said suddenly. "About the butterflies." As Maxwell repeated the story, he noticed Margaret watching him with an unreadable expression. When Lucy drifted back to sleep, Margaret stayed in her chair, studying her granddaughter's face. "Rachel used to talk about a garden like that," she said quietly. "She'd draw pictures of it, fill pages with descriptions of flowers and fountains. I always thought she was just dreaming." She looked at Maxwell. "She saw it, didn't she? Sarah's garden." Maxwell nodded, memories washing over him. "I took her there once during that summer we were together. Sarah was away visiting her sister." He paused. "Rachel was so young, so full of life. She made me feel young again, too. But not young enough to choose her over your ambitions." The words stung with truth. "I was afraid," he admitted. "My marriage to Sarah was struggling. The company was everything to me then. Rachel deserved better than a man who couldn't open his heart. And now, can you open your heart now, Maxwell? Because that little girl needs more than your money and guilty conscience. She needs a father who will love her completely, unconditionally." Before he could answer, Dr. Wilson appeared in the doorway, his face grave. "Mr. Reed, Mrs. Thompson, we need to talk. The latest tests show the infection has reached Lucy's heart. If we don't begin the transplant process within the next 48 hours, it will be too late." Maxwell stood, his own heart pounding. "Then let's do it. I'm ready." "There's a complication," Dr. Wilson continued. "Your cardiac enzyme levels are elevated. The stress of these past weeks has taken a toll. If we proceed with the donation now, the risk to your life is significant." The room grew very still. Maxwell looked at Lucy, so small and fragile in her hospital bed. She'd risked everything to save him that day in his office. Could he do any less for her? "How long?" Margaret's voice broke the silence. "How long does she have without the transplant?" "Days at most," Dr. Wilson replied softly. "Maybe less." Maxwell moved to Lucy's bedside, gently brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. In sleep, she looked so much like Rachel, the same delicate features, the same quiet strength. "Schedule the procedure," he said firmly. "Tomorrow morning." "Maxwell, please," Margaret started, but he held up his hand. "For 25 years, I chose myself over everyone else. I let my fear and ambition rule every decision." He took Lucy's small hand in his. "I won't choose myself this time. I can't." What he didn't say, what he held silent in his heart, was that his decision wasn't just about saving Lucy. It was about saving himself, the part of his soul that had withered and died long ago in Sarah's garden, among the roses that no longer bloomed. That evening, as medical staff prepared for the next day's procedure, Maxwell sat alone in the hospital chapel. He wasn't a religious man, but something about the quiet space drew him in. Moonlight filtered through stained glass windows, casting colored shadows on the empty pews. The door opened softly and Helen entered, carrying a stack of papers. She sat beside him without speaking, her presence as steady and reassuring as it had been through 2 decades of crises and triumphs. "The board is meeting tomorrow morning," she finally said. "They're concerned about the company's stability. She couldn't finish the sentence. "If I die on the operating table," Maxwell completed for her. He took the papers she offered, documents transferring control of his company to a trust with Helen as executor. Everything he owned would go to Lucy. As he signed his name, memories flooded back. Building his empire had once seemed so important. Now, looking at his signature on the papers that would give it all away, he felt only a profound sense of peace. "There's something else," Helen said hesitantly. She pulled an old photograph from her purse. "I found this in the company archives." The photo showed a much younger Maxwell at a company Christmas party. Rachel stood beside him, her smile radiant, one hand resting protectively over her stomach. He hadn't noticed it then, but now the gesture was unmistakable. She had already known she was carrying his child. "I remember that night," he said softly. "Rachel tried to tell me something important, but I was too busy networking with potential investors. I told her it could wait. His voice broke. Everything important in my life always had to wait. A nurse appeared in the doorway. "Mr. Reed, Lucy's asking for you." He found his daughter awake and restless, her dark eyes bright with fever. Margaret had gone to her apartment to get fresh clothes, leaving them alone. "Are you scared?" Lucy asked as he sat beside her. "About tomorrow?" Maxwell considered lying, then decided she deserved the truth. "A little. Are you?" She nodded. "But it's okay to be scared sometimes. That's what Grandma says." She picked at a loose thread on her blanket. "Can I ask you something?" "Anything." She hesitated. "If everything goes okay tomorrow, will you take me to see the garden?" "Just once." Maxwell's throat tightened. "I'll do better than that. I'll bring the garden back to life. We'll plant new roses together, and you can help design the pathways. We'll make it even more beautiful than before." Lucy's face lit up. "Really? You promise?" "I promise." He squeezed her hand gently. "And there's something else I need to tell you. Something I should have said the moment I found out." He took a deep breath. "Lucy, I'm your father." He waited for shock, anger, rejection. Instead, Lucy smiled softly. "I know," she whispered. "I saw the picture of my mom in your office that day. We have the same smile." Maxwell stared at her in amazement. "You knew? All this time?" "Mom's diary had your picture in it, and letters she wrote but never sent." Lucy's voice grew drowsy. "She said you weren't ready to be a dad then, but maybe you're ready now?" Tears rolled down Maxwell's cheeks as he gathered her small hand in both of his. "I'm ready now, sweetheart. And I promise you, if we get through, tomorrow I'll spend every day making up for lost time." Lucy's eyes drifted closed. "Tell me more about the garden," she murmured. "About the butterflies." Maxwell began describing Sarah's garden again, painting pictures with words until Lucy fell asleep. But as he watched her breathing, so shallow now, so fragile, fear gripped his heart. What if he lost her? What if, after finding her, after finally opening his heart to love again, she slipped away like Sarah, like Rachel? How many second chances could one man expect in a lifetime? Outside the hospital windows, the moon sailed behind clouds, casting the room in darkness. In a few hours, they would both face the greatest test of their lives, and no amount of money, power, or promises could guarantee they would both survive to see the roses bloom again. Dawn broke over the city, painting the hospital room in shades of pale gold. Maxwell hadn't slept, spending the night watching Lucy's chest rise and fall. With each precious breath, Margaret had returned and dozed in a chair nearby, her face lined with worry even in sleep. A soft knock announced the arrival of the pre-op team. Dr. Wilson entered with several nurses, his expression professionally neutral. "Has time to begin preparations," he said quietly. Lucy stirred as the nurses started their work, her eyes fluttering open. "Daddy!" she called out weakly, reaching for Maxwell's hand. The word pierced his heart. It was the first time she had called him that. "I'm here, sweetheart," he said, moving closer. "Will you—" She paused, gathering strength. "Will you sing to me? Like the video?" Maxwell looked confused until Margaret spoke up. Rachel made videos for her before she died. She would sing Lucy's favorite lullaby. "I don't know it," Maxwell admitted, feeling the weight of all he had missed. "You'll stay over, won't you?" Lucy asked instead, her voice barely a whisper. "After the operation?" "Of course I will. And when you're stronger, we'll start planning. That garden together." He tried to keep his voice steady to hide his fear. The nurses began wheeling Lucy's bed toward the door. Margaret leaned down to kiss her granddaughter's forehead, whispering words of love. As they reached the hallway, Lucy called out again, "Daddy, I'm glad I found you." Maxwell stood frozen, watching until they disappeared around the corner. A different nurse approached him. "Mr. Reed, we need to prep you now." The next hour passed in a blur of medical procedures and consent forms. Just before they wheeled him into surgery, Helen arrived with more papers requiring his signature. "The board sends their best wishes," she said, but her eyes told a different story. The company was in turmoil, shares dropping as news of his condition leaked to the press. "None of it matters now," Maxwell said. "Just make sure Lucy is taken care of no matter what happens." Dr. Wilson appeared in his surgical garb. "Are you ready, Mr. Reed?" "Wait," Maxwell called out. "Lucy is she okay?" "She's being prepped in the next room. We'll begin her procedure as soon as we harvest your cells." The doctor hesitated. "Mr. Reed, I need to remind you one last time, the risk to your heart is significant. If anything goes wrong—" "Just promise me one thing," Maxwell interrupted. "If you have to choose, save her, not me." Margaret, who had been standing quietly nearby, stepped forward. "No," she said firmly. "You saved them both, Doctor. That little girl needs her father." As they wheeled him towards surgery, Maxwell caught glimpses of his reflection in the passing windows. He hardly recognized himself anymore. The powerful businessman was gone, replaced by something he hadn't been in decades. Simply a father, terrified of losing his child. The operating room lights blazed overhead as the anesthesiologist prepared his injection. Maxwell closed his eyes, thinking of Lucy's smile, so like Rachel's. He had failed them both once before. He couldn't fail again. "Starting anesthesia now," a voice said. "Count backward from 10. 10, 9, 8. The numbers blurred as medication pulled him under. His last conscious thought was of Sarah's garden, of Lucy running through the roses, of second chances that came at the highest price. What he didn't know was that while he drifted into unconsciousness, Lucy was having complications in the next room. Her weakened heart was struggling with the pre-op medication. As his own heart rate began to slow, hers was racing dangerously fast. In the waiting room, Margaret clutched her rosary, while Helen paced, both women united in their vigil for the father and daughter, fighting separate battles behind closed doors. Outside, the morning sun continued to rise, indifferent to the drama unfolding within the hospital walls, where two lives hung precariously in the balance. The hours crawled by in the waiting room. Margaret had worn a path in the floor with her pacing, while Helen sat rigidly in an uncomfortable chair, her phone silent for once. Neither woman spoke much, each lost in their own prayers and worries. Around noon, Dr. Wilson emerged, still, in his surgical scrubs. Both women stood, bracing themselves for news. "We've completed the cell harvesting from Mr. Reed," he began. "There were some complications. His heart rate dropped dangerously low at one point, but we managed to stabilize him. He's in recovery now." "And Lucy?" Margaret's voice trembled. The doctor's expression grew more serious. "We've had to delay her procedure. Her body is too weak right now to handle the transplant. We're giving her medication to strengthen her system, but—" He spread his hands helplessly. "The next 24 hours will be critical." Helen sank back into her chair. "Can we see them?" "Mr. Reed is still unconscious, but you can sit with him. Lucy is sedated but stable for now. I suggest taking turns." Margaret went to Lucy's room while Helen headed for Maxwell's. The recovery room was quiet except for the steady beeping of monitors. Maxwell lay still, his face pale against the white pillows, looking older and more vulnerable than Helen had ever seen him. She sat beside his bed, remembering another hospital vigil years ago when Sarah was dying. Maxwell had been different then, controlled, distant, as if keeping his emotions tightly locked away could somehow stop death from taking his wife. Now those carefully constructed walls were crumbling, brought down by a little girl's unconditional love and his own desperate fight to save her. A nurse entered to check Maxwell's vitals. "His heart rate is improving," she said encouragingly. "He's stronger than we expected." "He has to be," Helen replied softly. "He has someone to live for." Now, hours passed. Helen worked on her tablet, managing the company crisis as best she could from the hospital. The board was calling for an emergency meeting. Shareholders were panicking. The empire Maxwell had built was threatening to collapse without him at the helm. Looking at him now, she wondered if he would even care anymore. Around sunset, Maxwell began to stir. His eyes opened slowly, focusing on Helen's familiar face. "Lucy?" he asked hoarsely. Helen explained the situation gently. Maxwell listened, his expression growing more troubled with each word. "I need to see her," he said, trying to sit up. "Mr. Reed, please," the nurse protested. "You're not strong enough yet." But Maxwell was already pulling at the monitors attached to his chest. "Either help me to her room, or I'll crawl there myself." The nurse looked helplessly at Helen, who nodded. Together, they helped Maxwell into a wheelchair. The short journey to Lucy's room left him breathless and pale, but his determination never wavered. Margaret looked up as they entered. Lucy lay motionless in her bed, her small face nearly as white as the sheets. Only the gentle rise and fall of her chest showed she was still fighting. "Has she woken at all?" Maxwell asked. Margaret shook her head. "The doctors say her body is exhausted. They're giving her medicine to help her get stronger, but—" She couldn't finish. Maxwell wheeled himself to Lucy's bedside, taking her tiny hand in his. It felt cooler than before, more fragile. "I'm here, sweetheart," he whispered. "Daddy's here." The monitors beeped steadily, marking each precious heartbeat. Outside, darkness fell over the city, lights twinkling like earthbound stars. Helen and Margaret withdrew quietly, leaving father and daughter alone. Maxwell began to talk softly, telling Lucy about the garden they would create together. He described the roses they would plant, the paths they would design, the butterflies they would watch on warm summer days. His voice grew hoarse, but still he talked, holding onto her hand like a lifeline. "I know you're tired," he said. "I know it's hard to keep fighting. But please, Lucy, please don't leave me. Not when I've just found you." A tear fell onto their joined hands. Maxwell didn't bother wiping it away. Let the world see him cry. Let them see that the mighty Maxwell Reed had finally learned what truly mattered. What he didn't know was that this night would become the longest of his life, as Lucy's condition would take an unexpected turn that would test his newfound faith and challenge everything he thought he understood about love, sacrifice, and the true meaning of wealth. Just past midnight, Lucy's fever spiked dangerously high. The quiet routine of the hospital floor erupted into controlled chaos as nurses rushed in with ice. Packs and doctors barked urgent orders. Maxwell, still weak from his own procedure, refused to leave her side despite the medical staff's protests. "Temperatures at 104 and rising," a nurse called out. "Blood pressure dropping." Dr. Wilson appeared, his face grim as he checked Lucy's vital signs. "We need to get the fever down now, or her organs will start failing." Maxwell watched helplessly as they packed ice around his daughter's small body. Her skin had taken on a grayish tinge, and her breathing was becoming more labored with each passing minute. "What about the transplant?" he asked desperately. "Can't we start it now?" "Her body's too weak," Dr. Wilson replied. "The procedure, how it'd kill her." He turned to a nurse. "Start her on the strongest antibiotics we have, and get a cooling blanket in here." Margaret arrived, having been called at home. She took one look at Lucy and sank into a chair, her hands clasped in silent prayer. Helen stood in the doorway, her usual composure cracking as she watched the scene unfold. Hours crept by. The medical team worked tirelessly, trying everything in their arsenal to bring Lucy's temperature down. Maxwell held her hand, whispering encouragement, willing his own strength into her failing body. Around 3 in the morning, Lucy's eyes fluttered open. "Cold," she whispered. "So cold." "I know, sweetheart," Maxwell said, his heart breaking. "The doctors are trying to help you get better." Her dark eyes, glazed with fever, fixed on his face. "Tell me about the butterflies again." Maxwell's voice shook as he began describing Sarah's garden once more. "There were monarchs with wings like stained glass, and tiny blue ones that looked like pieces of sky. Will they come back?" Lucy's words were barely audible. "Yes, my darling. When you're stronger, we'll plant flowers to attract them. Hundreds of butterflies just for you." A ghost of a smile touched her lips before her eyes closed again. The monitors continued their relentless beeping, marking each precious heartbeat. Buran was breaking when Dr. Wilson pulled Maxwell and Margaret aside. His expression told them everything before he spoke a word. "The antibiotics aren't working," he said quietly. "The infection is overwhelming her system. Without the transplant—" He left the sentence unfinished. "Then do it," Maxwell said. "Do the transplant now." "Mr. Reed, you don't understand. In her current condition, the procedure would be fatal, and you're still recovering. Donating more cells now could trigger another heart attack." "I don't care about the risk to me," Maxwell insisted. "We have to try something." Margaret laid a hand on his arm. "Maxwell, please, think about what Lucy would want. She saved your life once. Don't throw that gift away." Before he could respond, alarms began blaring from Lucy's room. They rushed back in to find nurses surrounding her bed, working frantically. "She's crashing," someone called out. "Heart rate dropping." Maxwell pushed his way to Lucy's side, grabbing her hand. It felt cold, so terribly cold. "Fight, sweetheart," he begged. "Please fight." The monitors continued their awful warning. Dr. Wilson was calling for medications, for equipment, for miracles that modern medicine might not be able to provide. In that moment of crisis, as Maxwell watched his daughter slipping away, something broke inside him. All his wealth, all his power meant nothing. He couldn't buy her health or bargain with death. For the first time in his life, Maxwell Reed was completely helpless. But as he would soon discover, sometimes the greatest strength comes when we admit our helplessness. And sometimes when all hope seems lost, the most unexpected people can show us the way back to light. As the medical team fought to stabilize Lucy, an elderly custodian quietly entered the room to empty the trash bins. She paused in her work, watching the scene with knowing eyes. When she spoke, her soft voice somehow cut through the chaos. "The child needs warmth," she said, "not just for her body, for her spirit." Maxwell turned, ready to dismiss this interruption, but something in the woman's weathered face made him listen. "When my grandson was very sick," she continued, "the doctors had given up hope. But his mother held him and sang to him through the night. The love in her voice called him back." Margaret stepped forward. "Lucy's mother used to sing to her every night, no matter how tired she was." The old woman nodded. "The heart remembers such things." Dr. Wilson was focused on Lucy's vital signs, which had stabilized but remained dangerously weak. "We're running out of options," he admitted quietly. Maxwell looked at his daughter's pale face, remembering how she had pleaded with him not to die that day in his office. Her voice had pulled him back from the brink. Could his do the same for her? He leaned close to her ear and began to hum softly. He didn't know Rachel's lullaby, but he remembered another song, one Sarah had loved, that she would play on the piano in the evenings while tending her roses. His voice was rough, untrained, but he poured every ounce of love and hope he possessed into the melody. Margaret recognized the tune and joined in, her voice blending with his. Together, they sang to Lucy as monitors beeped and nurses moved quietly around them. Hours passed. The sun rose and set again. Maxwell's voice grew hoarse, but still he sang. He sang about gardens and butterflies, about second chances and love that never dies. He sang until the words became prayers, until the prayers became promises. Sometime, during that long vigil, Helen entered with urgent news about the company. Maxwell barely heard her. The empire he had spent his life building could crumble to dust. Nothing mattered except the tiny hand in his, the faint pulse beneath his fingers. Around midnight, Lucy's fever finally broke. Her breathing became deeper, more regular. The medical staff were cautiously optimistic, but Maxwell refused to leave her side. He had already missed too many nights of her life. As a new day dawned, Lucy's eyes opened. They were clear for the first time in days. "I heard you," she whispered, "you and Grandma singing." Maxwell's tears fell freely as he kissed her forehead. "We'll sing for you every day, sweetheart, for as long as you want." Dr. Wilson arrived to check her vital signs. His face registered surprise and relief. "This is remarkable. Her numbers are improving across the board. If this continues, I might be able to attempt the transplant in a few days." Margaret sank into a chair, overcome with emotion. The elderly custodian, who had stayed through her entire shift, smiled knowingly as she went about her work. Lucy's voice was weak, but determined as she asked, "Daddy, could you sing some more about the garden?" Maxwell gathered her small hand in his and began to sing again. This time his voice carried not desperation, but hope. Outside the window, the first rays of sunlight painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, promising a new day, a new beginning. But even as Lucy's condition improved, challenges still loomed. The transplant procedure remained risky for both of them. The board of directors was threatening to vote Maxwell out of his position, and somewhere in the hospital, test results were being processed that would reveal yet another shocking truth about Lucy's connection to his past. For now, though, none of that mattered. In the quiet hospital room, a father sang to his daughter about butterflies and roses, about love that could bridge any distance, heal any wound. And Lucy, holding tight to his hand, began to believe that sometimes the most beautiful gardens grow from the hardest ground. In the days following Lucy's recovery from the fever, a gentle routine developed. Maxwell worked from her hospital room, handling urgent business matters from a small folding table while she slept. Margaret brought fresh flowers daily, and even Helen found herself spending more time sitting with Lucy, helping her with puzzles and drawings. But on a quiet Thursday morning, Dr. Wilson entered with an expression that made Maxwell's heart sink. The doctor held a manila envelope in his hands, his knuckles white from gripping it too tightly. "Mr. Reed, Mrs. Thompson, could we speak privately?" Margaret started to rise, but Lucy's small voice interrupted. "No secrets. Mommy always said, secrets hurt people." Dr. Wilson hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Very well. We've received some unexpected results from Lucy's latest blood work." He pulled several papers from the envelope. "The genetic markers we found, they're extremely unusual." Maxwell leaned forward. "What do you mean?" "Lucy's blood type and genetic profile show markers that are remarkably similar to your late wife's medical records." The room fell silent. Maxwell felt as if all the air had been sucked out of his lungs. "That's impossible," he whispered. But even as he spoke, memories flooded back. Sarah's last year of life, when she had grown so distant, spending weeks at a time at their summer house. The way she would change the subject whenever he mentioned children. The tears in her eyes when she looked at photos of Rachel, whom she had met only once at that Christmas party. Margaret's voice shook as she spoke. "Rachel never told me who adopted her baby." "What baby?" Maxwell asked. "The one before Lucy. She had another child years earlier, gave it up for adoption when she was just 17. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. She never got over. That's why she was so determined to keep Lucy, to give her all the love she couldn't give her first child. Maxwell's mind raced. The timing would have been right. Sarah had always wanted children, but they had. Discovered early in their marriage that she couldn't conceive. She had thrown herself into her garden instead, nurturing roses when she couldn't nurture a child. Had she known? Had she somehow found Rachel's baby and adopted it in secret? Never. Telling him because she feared his reaction? Had she carried that burden alone all those years? Lucy watched the adults with wise eyes. Is that why I dream about the garden? Because it was my sister's garden too? We'll need to run more tests to confirm, Dr. Wilson said gently. But if these results are accurate, it means Rachel's first daughter was raised by my wife, Maxwell finished, and now her second daughter needs a transplant that only I can provide. He laughed, a sound caught between joy and pain. Sarah always said there were no coincidences in life. Margaret reached for Lucy's hand. Rachel would say the same thing. She believed everything happened for a reason. Does this change anything? Lucy asked, her voice small. About the transplant? No, sweetheart, Dr. Wilson assured her. In fact, these genetic markers might explain why Mr. Reed is such a perfect match for the procedure. Sometimes the most unlikely connections prove to be the strongest. Maxwell moved to Lucy's bedside, gathering her tiny hand in his. The only thing this changes is that now we know your mother and Sarah were connected long before any of us realized. Maybe they worked together somehow, making sure you would find me when I needed you most. Lucy smiled weakly. And when you needed me to save you. Yes, Maxwell whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Exactly when I needed saving. But even as they processed this revelation, another crisis was brewing. Outside the hospital room, Helen took an urgent call from the board of directors. The vote to remove Maxwell from his position was scheduled for the next morning. And in the hospital's laboratory, technicians were discovering concerning changes in Lucy's latest test results, changes that would force everyone to make impossible choices sooner than they had planned. The threads of past and present were pulling tighter, weaving a pattern none of them could have foreseen. And somewhere, perhaps, Sarah and Rachel were watching, their love reaching across time and space to protect the little girl who had united their stories in ways no one could have imagined. The next morning arrived with a sense of impending crisis. Helen paced outside Lucy's room, her phone buzzing constantly with messages from board members and shareholders. Inside, Maxwell sat with his daughter, trying to focus on the colorful picture she was drawing, rather than the decisions that lay ahead. "It's the garden," Lucy explained, adding another flower to her artwork. "But I made the roses rainbow-colored. Do you think that's okay?" "I think it's perfect," Maxwell replied, his throat tight. "Sarah would have loved it." Dr. Wilson appeared in the doorway, his face grave. "Mr. Reed, we need to talk, the latest results." Before he could continue, Helen burst into the room. "Max, I'm sorry, but you need to see this." She held out her tablet, displaying a news website. The headline made Maxwell's blood run cold. "Reed Empire in Crisis. Board moves to oust CEO." Lucy looked up from her drawing. "Are you in trouble, Daddy?" Maxwell forced a smile. "Nothing for you to worry about, sweetheart. Just grown-up business stuff." He turned to Dr. Wilson. "What were you saying about the results?" The doctor glanced at Lucy, then at Margaret, who had just arrived with fresh flowers. "Perhaps we should step outside." In the hallway, Dr. Wilson didn't mince words. "Her condition is deteriorating faster than we anticipated. The infection is becoming resistant to the antibiotics. If we don't proceed with the transplant within the next 24 hours, I'm afraid." "Then do it," Maxwell interrupted. "Now, today." "Mr. Reed, you haven't fully recovered from the cell harvesting. Your heart." "I don't care about my heart." "But I do," came a small voice behind them. Lucy stood in the doorway of her room, leaning against the door frame for support. "I don't want you to die, Daddy. Not for me." Maxwell knelt before her, ignoring the protest in his chest. "Lucy, listening to you that day in my office was the best decision I ever made. Let me make another good decision now." She shook her head, dark eyes filling with tears. "Mommy's diary said she left you because she wanted you to be happy. She didn't want you to be sad because of us. I don't want you to be sad either." Margaret stepped forward. "There must be another option." Dr. Wilson hesitated. "There is an experimental procedure being tested in Boston. It's less invasive, but—" He paused. "It's also less likely to succeed." Helen, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. "The board meeting starts in an hour. Max, if you're not. There, they'll vote you out. Everything you've built will mean nothing if she dies," Maxwell finished. He looked at his daughter, so small and fragile, yet so determined. "Lucy, Go to your meeting," she said firmly. "I'll wait for you. I promise." The next hour passed in a blur. Maxwell changed into a suit Helen had brought, kissed Lucy goodbye, and headed to his office. The familiar surroundings felt strange now, as if he were walking through a dream of his old life. The boardroom was packed when he arrived. Faces he'd known for years looked at him with a mixture of sympathy and calculation. The vote was a formality. He knew he had already lost their confidence. As the chairman began reading the motion to remove him, Maxwell's phone buzzed. A text from Margaret. "Come back now, Lucy needs you." He stood up, interrupting the chairman mid-sentence. "I apologize, but I have to go." "Maxwell," the chairman warned, "if you leave now, the vote will proceed without you." He looked around. The room at the Empire he had spent his life building. All the deals, the acquisitions, the power plays that had once seemed so important. None of it mattered now. "Then vote," he said simply. "My daughter needs me." As he walked out of the boardroom, leaving behind the whispers and shocked faces, Maxwell felt lighter than he had in years. He had finally chosen love over power, family over fortune. But would he reach Lucy in time? And would she forgive him for not being there sooner? The answers to these questions would change everything, not just for Maxwell and Lucy, but for everyone whose lives they had touched. Because sometimes the greatest victories come disguised as surrender, and the truest wealth lies in the things we give away. Maxwell rushed back to the hospital, his heart pounding with each step. When he reached Lucy's floor, he found Margaret, in tears outside the room. "Her fever's back," she whispered, "worse than before." Inside, the scene was hauntingly familiar. Nurses rushing around, monitors beeping urgently, Dr. Wilson barking orders. But this time felt different, more final. Lucy lay motionless in her bed, her skin nearly translucent. The rainbow-colored garden she had drawn hours earlier still sat on her bedside table, its bright colors a stark contrast to the clinical whiteness of the room. "What happened?" Maxwell demanded. Dr. Wilson turned from checking Lucy's vitals. "The infection has reached her heart. We've started her on the strongest antibiotics we have, but..." He shook his head. "She's fighting, but she's very weak." Maxwell moved to his daughter's bedside, taking her small hand in his. It felt cold, so terribly cold. "Lucy? Sweetheart, I'm here. Daddy's here." Her eyelids fluttered but didn't open. The monitors continued their relentless rhythm, each beep a reminder of how fragile her hold on life had become. Helen appeared in the doorway, her face flushed from running. "The board voted," she said quietly. "I'm so sorry, Max." He didn't turn around. "None of that matters now. Just find out about that experimental procedure in Boston. Call anyone you need to call. Offer anything." The hours crept by. Lucy's condition remained critical but stable. Maxwell refused to leave her side, even when the nurses brought him paperwork confirming his removal as CEO. He signed without reading, his eyes never leaving his daughter's face. Around midnight, the elderly custodian returned. She worked quietly, emptying trash bins and straightening chairs. Before leaving, she paused beside Lucy's bed. "You know," she said softly, "sometimes love needs a witness, someone to remember, to tell the story." Maxwell looked up, puzzled. The old woman smiled gently. "My grandson, the one I told you about. He didn't make it, but his mother's love, that lived on. In memories, in stories, in the way she lived her life afterward." She touched Lucy's blanket softly. "Love like that changes things, changes people." As if in response to her words, Lucy stirred. Her eyes opened slowly, focusing on Maxwell's face. "You came back," she whispered. "Of course I did, sweetheart. I'll always come back for you." She tried to smile, but it turned into a grimace of pain. "It hurts, Daddy, everything hurts." Maxwell felt his heart breaking. "I know, baby, I know. But you have to keep fighting just a little longer." Lucy's eyes filled with tears. "I'm trying, but I'm so tired." She looked at her drawing on the bedside table. "I'm sorry we didn't get to make the garden together." "We will," Maxwell promised, fiercely. "You'll get better and we'll plant every color of rose there is. The butterflies will come back and..." "Mr. Reed," Dr. Wilson's voice cut through his desperate promises. "A moment, please." In the hallway, the doctor's expression was grave. "We've received word from Boston. The experimental procedure. They don't think she's strong enough now. And your own cardiac condition..." Maxwell slammed his hand against the wall, ignoring the pain. "Then what do we do? There has to be something." "There might be," came a quiet voice. They turned to find Helen, standing there holding a thick file. "I've been doing research about Sarah's last year, about Rachel's first child." She opened the file. "There's someone you need to meet." But before she could explain further, alarms began blaring from Lucy's room. They rushed back in to find nurses surrounding her bed, working frantically. "Her heart rate's dropping," someone called out. "We're losing her." Maxwell pushed through to his daughter's side. Her eyes were closed, her breathing shallow. The bay. Monitors painted a terrifying picture of a small body losing its fight. "Lucy, please," he begged. "Please don't leave me, not now. Not when I've just learned how to love again." What he didn't know was that at that very moment, someone else was rushing toward the hospital. Someone whose arrival would change everything. The question was, would they arrive in time? The medical team worked desperately to stabilize Lucy as Maxwell watched helplessly. Margaret had sunk to her knees in prayer, while Helen paced the hallway, constantly checking her phone. "Blood pressure still dropping," a nurse called out. Dr. Wilson ordered more medications, his face tight with concentration. Through the chaos, the elderly custodian appeared again. She moved quietly to Lucy's bedside opposite Maxwell and began humming softly, the same lullaby he had heard Lucy singing to herself days earlier. Gradually, impossibly, Lucy's vital signs began to stabilize. The alarms quieted, though her condition remained critical. Dr. Wilson stepped back, wiping his brow. "She's fighting," he said, "but she needs more than medicine now. She needs a miracle." As if on cue, Helen burst into the room. "She's here," she announced, slightly breathless. "In the lobby." "Who's here?" Maxwell asked. Before Helen could answer, a young woman appeared in the doorway. She was in her early 30s, with Sarah's graceful features and Rachel's dark eyes. Maxwell felt his heart stop as recognition hit him. "Emily?" he whispered. The woman stepped forward, tears streaming down her face. "Hello, Father." Maxwell struggled to find words. The last time he had seen Emily, she had been a newborn in Sarah's arms. The daughter his wife had adopted without telling him, Rachel's first child. Now here she stood, a grown woman, looking so much like both her mothers that it took his breath away. "How?" he managed finally. "Helen found me," Emily explained. "She's been searching ever since she discovered the connection." She moved to Lucy's bedside, gazing down at her small half-sister. "I came as soon as I heard. I'm a doctor at Boston Children's Hospital and—" She paused, looking at Dr. Wilson. "I've been working on a modified version of the transplant procedure, one that might save them both." Hope flickered in Maxwell's chest for the first time in hours. "You can help her," Emily nodded. "The procedure I've developed uses a different approach. Instead of a single large donation of cells, we do multiple smaller harvests over time. It's easier on both donor and recipient." She touched Lucy's hand gently. "When Helen told me about Lucy, about you, I knew I had to come." "But why?" Maxwell asked. "After everything." "Because Sarah, my mother, taught me about forgiveness, about how love can bridge any distance." Emily's voice caught. "She told me about my birth mother before she died, about you. She wanted me to know I was loved by so many people, even if they couldn't all be part of my life." Margaret had risen, from her knees, staring at Emily in wonder. "You look so much like Rachel." "I have pictures," Emily said softly, "if you'd like to see them sometime." She turned back to Dr. Wilson. "But right now we need to focus on Lucy. I've brought everything we need for the procedure. If we start tonight—" Lucy stirred, her eyes fluttering open. They fixed on Emily with a strange recognition. "I know you," she whispered. "From my dreams. You were in the garden with the butterflies." Emily took her sister's small hand. "Yes, little one. And now I'm here to help make those dreams come true." For the next hour, Emily and Dr. Wilson discussed the procedure while nurses prepared the necessary equipment. Maxwell listened, hardly daring to believe this chance at salvation had appeared so unexpectedly. "There are still risks," Emily warned him, "for both of you, but they're significantly lower than with the traditional procedure." Maxwell looked at his daughters, the one he had never known and the one he had only just found. Both miracles in their own way, both bridges between past and present, between loss and love. "When can we start?" he asked. But before Emily could answer, Lucy's monitors began screaming again. This time the alarms were different, more urgent, more final. Dr. Wilson rushed to check her vitals, his face paling. "Her heart's failing," he announced. "We need to decide now. Either we try the procedure immediately without proper preparation, or... He left the sentence unfinished, but everyone understood. They were out of time, out of options. The only choice left was between a desperate gamble and certain loss. Maxwell looked at Emily, seeing in her face the same determination he felt in his heart. Without words, father and daughter reached an understanding. They would fight for Lucy, together no matter the cost. The question was, would their combined strength be enough to save her? The emergency procedure room hummed with tense energy as Emily and Dr. Wilson prepared both Maxwell and Lucy. Margaret and Helen waited outside, holding on to each other for support, while the elderly custodian silently mopped the floors nearby, her presence somehow comforting. The first harvest will be the most critical, Emily explained as she inserted an IV into Maxwell's arm. Her hands were steady, but her voice trembled slightly. We'll take just enough cells to stabilize Lucy, then wait a few hours before the next round. Maxwell watched as nurses transferred Lucy to the bed beside his. She looked so small, so fragile. Her breathing was shallow, each breath a visible struggle. "Daddy?" she whispered. "I'm scared." "Me too, sweetheart," he admitted. "But your sister is here now. She's going to help make you better." Lucy turned her head slightly, looking at Emily. "Will you? Tell me about the garden, the one where you grew up." Emily's eyes filled with tears as she adjusted Lucy's IV. "It was beautiful. Mother, Sarah, spent hours there. She taught me the name of every rose, every butterfly." She smiled softly. She always said the garden was magic, that it could heal broken hearts. "Did it heal yours?" Lucy asked, "when you found out about everything?" Emily paused in her preparations. "Yes," she said finally. "It did. Because in that garden I learned that love doesn't have to make sense. It just has to be real." Dr. Wilson approached with the harvesting equipment. "We need to begin, Mr. Reed, are you ready?" Maxwell reached across the space between the beds, taking Lucy's hand. "Together, sweetheart. We'll do this together." The procedure began. Maxwell felt the familiar ache in his chest as they drew the first batch of cells, but he focused on Lucy's face, on her small hand in his. Emily moved between them, monitoring both their vital signs with intense concentration. First harvest. "Complete," Dr. Wilson announced, "beginning the transfer." Lucy whimpered softly as the cells began flowing into her system. Emily stroked her hair, humming the lullaby they had all come to know. Minutes stretched into hours. The medical team worked tirelessly, harvesting cells from Maxwell in small batches, transferring them to Lucy, waiting to see how her body would respond. Each time, the pain in Maxwell's chest grew stronger, but he refused to stop. Dawn was breaking when Emily checked Lucy's latest blood work. Her face lit up with cautious hope. The cells are integrating, her numbers are improving. But just as relief began to spread through the room, Maxwell's heart monitor began to sound a warning. Emily rushed to his side, checking his vitals. "His heart rate's elevated," she reported tensely. "We need to pause the harvest." "No," Maxwell protested weakly. "Keep going. She needs more." "She needs you alive," Emily said firmly. "We'll wait an hour, let your heart recover." Lucy stirred on her bed. "Daddy, are you okay?" Maxwell tried to smile through his pain. "Just tired, sweetheart, like when you've been planting roses all day." "Tell me more," Lucy whispered. "About the roses we'll plant." So Maxwell began describing their future garden again, his voice growing weaker but never stopping. Emily listened as she monitored their vital signs, tears rolling down her cheeks as she heard her own childhood memories, echoed in his words. Outside the procedure room, Margaret and Helen maintained their vigil. The elderly custodian had brought them coffee and sat with them, sharing her own quiet wisdom. "Sometimes," she said softly, "when we think we're saving someone else, we're really saving ourselves." Inside, Maxwell's voice faltered as another wave of pain hit him. Emily checked his heart monitor, her face tightening with concern. They were walking a dangerous line between hope and disaster, between saving one life and losing another. And through it all, Lucy held onto her father's hand, her grip growing stronger even as his grew weaker. But neither of them knew that the real test and the real miracle was still to come. As morning light filtered through the hospital windows, Lucy's condition steadily improved while Maxwell's deteriorated. Emily worked tirelessly between them, her medical training warring with her emotional involvement. "His heart can't take much more," she told Dr. Wilson, quietly. "But she needs at least 2 more transfers to stabilize completely." Through his haze of pain, Maxwell heard them discussing his condition. "Don't stop," he managed to say. "Whatever happens to me, save her." Emily touched his arm gently. "That's not how this works anymore, Father. Lucy needs you alive, we all do." Lucy had been drifting in and out of consciousness, but now she opened her eyes fully. "Emily," she called softly, Could you sing the garden song? The one Mother used to sing to you." Emily froze. "How did you know about that? I hear it sometimes in my dreams. A lady with blonde hair singing about roses and sunshine." Maxwell watched as Emily's face transformed with emotion. "Sarah," she whispered. "She used to sing it every evening in the garden." She took a shaky breath and began to sing softly, her voice trembling at first but growing stronger. As the melody filled the room, something extraordinary happened. Maxwell felt the pain in his chest begin to ease, as if the music itself was healing him. Lucy's vital signs, displayed on the monitors, showed improvement too. Dr. Wilson checked their readings in amazement. "This is incredible. Both their numbers are stabilizing." The elderly custodian, who had slipped quietly into the room, nodded as if she had expected nothing less. "Music is its own kind of medicine," she said, "especially when it carries so much love." Hour by hour, Lucy grew stronger. Color returned to her cheeks and her breathing became deeper, more regular. Maxwell's heart rate stabilized, though he remained weak from the multiple cell harvests. Emily continued to move between them, checking vitals, adjusting medications, but now she hummed constantly, Sarah's garden song becoming a thread that seemed to connect them all. Late in the afternoon, Dr. Wilson announced that Lucy's latest blood work showed no trace of the infection. The transplanted cells had done their work. She would need monitoring and follow-up care, but the immediate danger had passed. "It's really over?" Margaret asked, hardly daring to believe it. "The critical phase is," Emily confirmed. "Now comes the recovery." She looked at Maxwell with concern. "For both of them." Lucy tugged at Emily's sleeve. "Will you stay? Help us make the garden?" Emily glanced at Maxwell, uncertainty crossing her face. They had worked together to save Lucy, but decades of separation and unspoken feelings still lay between them. "Please," Maxwell said softly, "stay. Help me make up for lost time with both of you." Before Emily could respond, Helen appeared in the doorway. "Max, the board is here. They want to talk about reinstating you as CEO." Maxwell didn't even look up from Lucy's bedside. "Tell them thank you, but no. The company needs someone who will put it first. That's not me anymore." "Then what will you do?" Helen asked. "I'm going to restore Sarah's garden," he replied, "with my daughter's help. And then," he smiled at Lucy, "we're going to create something new. A place where children who are sick can come to heal, surrounded by roses and butterflies." Lucy's face lit up. "Like a magic garden." "Exactly like that," Emily said, making her decision. "And I'll help. I can set up a pediatric clinic there, work with the children myself." The elderly custodian smiled from her corner of the room. "Sometimes the best gardens grow from places where there was once only pain." As if to confirm her words, a butterfly, the first of the season, fluttered past the window, its wings catching the late afternoon sun. Lucy pointed at it excitedly, and for the first time her voice was strong and clear. But even as they celebrated this moment of hope, none of them knew that the greatest challenge and the most unexpected miracle was still to come. Because sometimes healing the body is only the first step. Healing the heart, with all its scars and secrets, requires a different kind of magic altogether. 2 weeks later, Lucy was strong enough to leave the hospital. Maxwell had arranged for Emily to stay in his penthouse apartment, But Lucy had one request before going home. "Can we see the garden first?" she asked. "Even if it's not fixed yet?" Maxwell exchanged glances with Emily and Margaret. The old summer house had been closed for 5 years since Sarah's death. None of them knew what condition the garden would be in. But Lucy's pleading eyes were impossible to resist, so on a bright spring morning they drove out to the Connecticut countryside. As they turned down the tree-lined driveway, Maxwell felt his heart tighten. Nothing had changed, and yet everything was different. The house stood as he remembered it, a graceful Victorian with wide porches and gabled windows. But it was the garden that drew their attention. What had once been Sarah's pride and joy was now overgrown, the rose bushes wild and tangled, the paths barely visible under weeds. Lucy, however, saw something different. "It's still here," she whispered, her face glowing. "All of it. It's just sleeping." She insisted on walking the paths herself, though she was still weak. Emily stayed, close beside her, while Maxwell and Margaret followed behind. The elderly custodian, who had somehow become part of their extended family, brought up the rear carrying a basket of sandwiches. "Look!" Lucy called out, pointing to a flash of color. There, growing defiantly through the weeds, was a single red rose. Its petals were perfect, untouched by the neglect around it. "Sarah's favorite variety," Emily said softly. She called them her forever roses because they bloomed no matter what. Maxwell watched as his daughters knelt together by the rose bush. Emily gently showed Lucy how to tell which branches were still alive, waiting to bloom again. The sight of them working together, dark heads bent close, made his throat tight with emotion. "They look like Rachel," Margaret observed, wiping away tears. "Both of them. The way they move, the way they smile." They set up a picnic near the old fountain, its basin dry but still elegant. As they ate, Lucy and Emily traded stories. Emily sharing memories of growing up in the garden, Lucy describing her dreams of what it could become. "We could make a special place," Lucy said excitedly, "where sick children could come and feel better like I did. With benches under the trees and paths wide enough for wheelchairs. And a butterfly house," Emily added, catching her enthusiasm. "I know someone who breeds healing gardens. We could create something amazing here." Maxwell listened to their plans, seeing the future taking shape through their eyes. But something still nagged at him, a piece of the puzzle he couldn't quite grasp. The elderly custodian seemed to sense his thoughts. "Sometimes," she said in her quiet way, "the things we think we've lost are just waiting to be found again." As if in response to her words, Lucy suddenly stood up. "There's something over there," she said, pointing to a far corner of the garden. "Something important." She led them down a nearly hidden path, pushing through overgrown branches. Maxwell didn't remember this part of the garden. It must have been one of Sarah's private spaces. They emerged in a small clearing. In the center stood a weathered wooden bench, and behind it, protected by twining roses, was a stone angel. At its base, barely visible through the greenery, were words carved in the stone. Emily gasped. "I remember this place." Mother would come, here to think, to write in her journal, but I never knew what the angel said. Together they cleared away the vines. The inscription slowly emerged. "For my 3 daughters, one born of my body, one born of my heart, and one yet to come. May this garden shelter you all when I am gone." Maxwell sank to his knees. Sarah had known about Emily's true parentage, about Rachel's first child, and somehow, impossibly, about Lucy. She had created this space for all of them, trusting that someday they would find their way here. Lucy touched the angel's face gently. "She was waiting for us," she said simply, "just like the roses were waiting." But as they stood in that sacred space, none of them realized that Sarah had left. More than just an inscription, somewhere in the old house, hidden away, was a journal that would reveal the final piece of their family's puzzle, and with it, a truth that would test their newfound bonds in ways they never expected. The discovery of Sarah's angel changed everything. They spent the rest of the afternoon exploring the old house, with Lucy leading the way as if she somehow knew where to go. Her strength seemed to grow with each step, as if the house itself was healing her. "Mother's study was up here," Emily said as they reached the second floor. The door stuck slightly, swollen with years of disuse. Inside, everything was exactly as Sarah had left it. Books on shelves, a shawl draped over her reading chair, dried roses in a vase on her desk. Lucy went straight to the desk, opening drawers with careful purpose. In the bottom one, she found what she seemed to be looking for, a leather-bound journal with pressed rose petals marking its pages. "How did you know?" Maxwell asked, amazed. "I saw it in my dreams," Lucy replied. "A lady with golden hair was writing in it, crying happy tears." Emily took the journal with trembling hands. "Mother wrote in this every day, but I never dared read it." "Read it now," the elderly custodian suggested from the doorway. "Some stories need to be told at exactly the right moment." They gathered in Sarah's reading nook as Emily opened the journal. Her voice shook as she began to read. "My dearest daughters, if you're reading this, then my prayers have been answered. You found each other, and with that, you found your way home to the garden. There's so much I need to tell you, so many secrets I've kept." The journal entries told an extraordinary story. Sarah had known about Emily's true parentage from the beginning. She had specifically sought out Rachel's baby to adopt, drawn by a connection she couldn't explain. Years later, when Rachel started working at Maxwell's company, Sarah recognized her immediately. "I watched from afar," she wrote, "as Rachel fell in love with my husband. I should have been angry, but instead I felt only sadness, for her, for Maxwell, for the walls he had built around his heart. When she left, carrying another child, I knew someday that child would be the key to healing our broken family." Lucy listened intently as Emily read, her small hand clasped in Maxwell's. Margaret wiped tears away as Sarah's words revealed how she had secretly helped Rachel over the years, making sure she and Lucy always had what they needed. "The garden has its own magic," Sarah wrote. "It knows what the heart needs even when we don't. Emily found healing here as a child. Lucy will find it too when the time is right. And Maxwell, my dear stubborn Maxwell, he'll finally learn that love is the only legacy that truly matters." The last entry was dated just days before Sarah's death. "I've seen her in my dreams, the little girl with Rachel's eyes and Maxwell's smile. She'll come when they need her most, this precious third daughter of my heart. She'll remind them all of what matters, of who they really are. And somehow she'll lead them back here, back to the garden where healing begins." Emily's voice trailed off. The room was silent, except for quiet sniffles. Even the elderly custodian was dabbing at her eyes with her apron. "She knew," Maxwell whispered. "All this time she knew everything." "Not everything," Lucy said softly. She reached for the journal, turning to the very last page. There, pressed between the pages, was a sealed envelope with Maxwell's name on it. His hands shook as he opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, covered in Sarah's elegant handwriting. "My dearest love, if you're reading this, then our garden has worked its magic once again. You've found our girls, all of them. And more importantly, you've found yourself. There's one last gift I've left for you, one last piece of the puzzle." Maxwell looked up from the letter, his face pale. "The garden cottage," he said. "Sarah's private sanctuary. She never let anyone go in there." "It's still here," Emily said, "behind the rose arbor, but it's been locked all these years." Lucy stood up, swaying slightly. "We need to go there, now." "Sweetheart, you should rest," Margaret protested. But Lucy was already heading for the door, moving with determined purpose. The others followed, drawn by her certainty. The cottage stood exactly as Maxwell remembered it, a tiny stone building almost hidden by climbing roses. The key was where Sarah had always kept it, under a loose brick by the door. None of them were prepared for what they found inside. But Sarah's final gift would change not just their future, but the lives of countless others who needed healing, both in body and soul. The cottage door creaked open, releasing the scent of dried roses and old paper. Dust motes danced in the shafts of afternoon light that filtered through cobwebbed windows, But it wasn't the musty atmosphere that made them all gasp. It was what covered every surface of the small room. Drawings. Hundreds of them. Detailed architectural plans and sketches showing a transformed version of the garden. Sarah had envisioned not just a restored space, but an entire healing center built around the original garden's footprint. "Look at these," Emily breathed, picking up one of the drawings. She designed everything: treatment rooms overlooking the rose gardens, meditation spaces, walking paths accessible to wheelchairs and hospital beds. Maxwell moved to a large drafting table in the center of the room. On it lay a thick folder marked the Garden of Hope Foundation. Inside were complete business plans, grant proposals, and lists of medical contacts. Everything needed to turn Sarah's vision into reality. "She didn't just dream this," he said quietly. "She planned it all, right down to the last detail." Lucy wandered the room, trailing her fingers over the drawings. She stopped at a sketch that showed children playing in a butterfly garden while receiving medical treatments. "This is what I saw in my dreams," she whispered. "This is why I had to find you." The elderly custodian picked up a piece of paper that had fallen to the floor. "There's more," she said, handing it to Maxwell. It was a letter from Rachel, dated just months before her death. In it, she thanked Sarah for all her secret help over the years and shared her own hopes for Lucy's future. "Something tells me she'll find her way to the garden someday," Rachel had written. "When she does, please make sure she knows how much she was loved by all of us." Margaret wiped tears from her eyes as she read the letter over Maxwell's shoulder. "They both knew," she said softly. "Both mothers knew their daughters would find each other here." Emily was examining more of the plans. "These are incredible. The medical facilities she designed, they're exactly what we'd need for a children's healing center. It's like she knew." "She did know," Lucy said with quiet certainty. "She knew everything." Maxwell sat heavily in Sarah's old chair, overwhelmed by the scope of what his wife had envisioned. All those years he'd thought she was just puttering in her garden. She had been planning this legacy of hope and healing. "I was so blind," he murmured. "So focused on building my own empire that I couldn't see the one she was creating right here." Lucy came to stand beside him, her small hand finding his. "But you see it now, Daddy, and we can make it real." "Yes," Emily added, her eyes shining. "With purpose. I can coordinate with my colleagues at Boston Children's. With these plans and your resources, the garden can help other children get better," Lucy finished, "like it helped me." The elderly custodian smiled from her corner. "The best gardens," she said softly, "are the ones that grow between generations." As they continued exploring the cottage, discovering more of Sarah's carefully laid plans, none of them noticed the butterfly that had followed them inside. It perched on one of the drawings, a sketch of 3 girls playing in a rose garden, while 2 women watched from a bench nearby. But there was still one more discovery to be made, one final piece of Sarah's plan that would ensure her dream wouldn't just live, but flourish for generations to come. It lay hidden in a place only Lucy would think to look, waiting for the perfect moment to be revealed. As evening approached, casting long shadows through the cottage windows, Lucy grew restless. She moved around the small space with purpose, as if searching for something specific. "What is it, sweetheart?" Maxwell asked, noticing her focused expression. "There's something else," she said. "Something important." She stopped in front of an old wooden cabinet, running her hands along its carved edges. "Here, it's in here." Emily helped her open the stiff doors. Inside, on the bottom shelf, sat a small iron box with roses etched into its lid. A note tied with faded ribbon was attached. "For my granddaughter when she finds her way home." Lucy's hands trembled as she lifted the box. "It's for me," she whispered. "From both of them." Inside they found 2 envelopes, one in Sarah's elegant handwriting, the other in Rachel's familiar script. But it was what lay beneath them that brought tears to everyone's eyes. A delicate silver charm bracelet with 3 rose-shaped charms. "I remember this," Emily gasped. "Mother wore it every day in the garden, but these charms, there were only 2 before." Maxwell recognized it as well. He had given Sarah the bracelet on their first anniversary, with a single rose charm. She had added a second when they adopted. Emily, now a third charm hung beside the others, newer but perfectly matched. "Read the letters," Margaret urged gently. Lucy opened Sarah's first. "My dearest granddaughter, I may never hold you in my arms, but I've held you in my heart since the day I learned of your existence. This bracelet has been waiting for you, just as the garden has been waiting. The 3 roses represent the 3 daughters who will bring my dream to life. Emily, who taught me that love knows no boundaries. You, my precious one, who will bridge the past and future, and those yet to come who will find healing in the garden we create. Wear it with love, and know that you were part of our family's story long before you entered it. All my love, Grandmother." "Sarah?" Lucy's voice shook as she read Rachel's letter next. "My darling Lucy, if you're reading this, then all my prayers have been answered. You've found your way to the garden, to your father, to the family that was always meant to be yours. Sarah has been our guardian angel, watching over us both even when I didn't know it. She helped me understand that love multiplies. It doesn't divide. The garden saved me once when I was young and lost. I know it will save others through you. You are the best of all of us. Sarah's vision, your father's strength, and I hope, a little of my heart. I'm sorry I couldn't stay to see you. Grow up, but I was never afraid for your future. I knew you would find your way here to this place where healing begins. Love always, Mom." Emily helped Lucy fasten the bracelet around her wrist. The silver roses caught the last rays of sunlight, sending tiny rainbows dancing across the cottage walls. "It's perfect," Lucy said, touching each charm gently, like they knew exactly what size I would be. The elderly custodian smiled knowingly. Love has a way of knowing such things. Maxwell watched his daughters, one he had lost and found again, one he had never known he had until she saved his life. Both of them carried pieces of Sarah and Rachel in their faces, their gestures, their hearts. "So," he said, picking up Sarah's plans, "shall we begin?" Emily's eyes lit up. "I can make some calls tonight, start gathering the medical team. And I can help design the children's areas," Lucy added excitedly. "I know what sick kids need to feel better." Margaret picked up Rachel's letter, reading it again through tears. They would be so proud, both of them. As they gathered the plans and prepared to leave the cottage, Lucy stopped suddenly. "Listen," she said. "Do you hear it?" They all fell silent. Through the open window came the faint sound of wind chimes, Sarah's old garden chimes that had hung silent for years. "The garden is waking up," Lucy said with certainty. "It knows we're home." But even as they celebrated this moment of connection and purpose, none of them could guess how Sarah's final gift would transform not just their lives, but the lives of countless others who would find their way to this place of healing. 1 year later, the Garden of Hope Foundation was preparing for its grand opening. The transformation was nothing short of miraculous. Sarah's vision had been brought to life with loving attention to every detail, but with additions that even she couldn't have imagined. Maxwell stood at the window of his new office, which overlooked the main garden. Workers were putting the finishing touches on the butterfly house, Lucy's special project. At 12 years old now, she had thrown herself into every aspect of the foundation's development, from helping design child-friendly treatment rooms to selecting which roses to plant. Emily had assembled an impressive medical team, combining traditional treatments with garden therapy. Her reputation at Boston Children's had drawn other skilled doctors who believed in the healing power of nature. The waiting list for the program was already months long. "Daddy," Lucy's voice called from the garden. "Come quick." The first butterfly emerged. Maxwell hurried outside to find Lucy and Emily crouched by a special enclosure, where they had been nurturing monarch chrysalises. A beautiful butterfly was slowly spreading its new wings, its orange and black colors brilliant in the morning. "Son, isn't it perfect?" Lucy breathed, her silver bracelet catching the light as she gestured excitedly. Just in time for the opening tomorrow. She had grown stronger over the past year, her own health blossoming along with the garden. The regular medical checkups showed no signs of her illness returning. Emily called it a miracle, but Lucy insisted it was just the garden's magic. Margaret appeared carrying a tray of lemonade. She had moved into the gardener's cottage, taking charge of the volunteer program that would help maintain the extensive grounds. The elderly custodian, whose name they had finally learned was Grace, had also stayed on, somehow always appearing exactly where she was needed most. "The first families arrive next week," Emily said, accepting a glass. "5 children to start with, then we'll gradually increase the number as we refine our programs." Maxwell watched as Lucy began explaining to a new volunteer about the different butterfly species they would be raising. She had become the heart of the foundation, her natural empathy drawing people in, making them believe in the possibility of healing. "Sarah would love this," Grace said softly, appearing beside him. But I don't think even she imagined how beautiful it would become. She was right. While they had followed Sarah's basic plans, the foundation had evolved into something more organic, shaped by the needs they discovered along the way. The original garden remained at its core, but now pathways led to various healing spaces, art therapy studios, music rooms, quiet nooks for reading or reflection. Helen, who had left her corporate career to become the foundation's administrator, approached with a stack of mail. "More donations," she reported happily, and 3 more doctors wanting to join the team. But Maxwell's attention was drawn to Lucy, who was now leading a small tour group through the butterfly house. She moved with such confidence, such purpose. Gone was the frightened little girl who had saved his life that day in his office. In her place was a young healer, already showing signs of the remarkable woman she would become. Emily joined him, slipping her arm through his. "Penny, for your thoughts." "Just thinking about how close I came to missing all this," he replied. "If Lucy hadn't found me that day." "But she did find you," Emily reminded him. "Just like I found my way back, just like Sarah and Rachel knew we would." The sound of children's laughter floated across the garden. A group of local kids who had been helping with the planting was playing near the fountain, their joy infectious. Lucy had insisted that the foundation's grounds be open to the community, because sometimes people need to heal things we can't see, she had said. As the afternoon sun bathed the garden in golden light, butterflies danced among the roses that Sarah had loved so much. Maxwell felt a deep sense of peace settle over him. His life had changed in ways he could never have imagined, all because a little girl had refused to let him die. But even as they prepared for the next day's celebration, none of them knew that their greatest test and their most profound miracle was still to come. The morning of the foundation's opening dawned clear and bright. Rose petals carpeted the pathways, and butterflies filled the air as if they too were celebrating. Hundreds of people gathered in the main garden, medical professionals, local families, media representatives, and most importantly, the first group of children who would be receiving treatment. Lucy stood with Emily at the entrance, greeting each arrival with a warmth that put nervous parents and scared children at ease. Her silver bracelet caught the sunlight as she bent down to talk to a little boy in a wheelchair, telling him about her own journey to health. Maxwell watched from the podium where he would soon give his opening speech. But as he observed his daughters working together, he realized the most important words wouldn't come from him today. When it was time for the ceremony to begin, he stepped aside, gesturing for Lucy to take his place. She looked surprised, but moved forward with quiet confidence. Emily stood beside her, one hand resting supportively on her shoulder. "A year ago," Lucy began, her clear voice carrying across the hushed crowd, "I was dying. Not just from my illness, but from loneliness, from feeling like I didn't belong anywhere." She touched her bracelet gently. But 2 amazing women, my grandmother Sarah and my mother Rachel, had already prepared the way for me. They knew that love, like these gardens, needs time to grow. She gestured to the transformed space around them. They also knew that healing isn't just about medicine. It's about finding your place in the world, about believing in magic and miracles. She smiled at Maxwell. "Sometimes it's about saving someone else when you think you're the one who needs saving." Emily stepped forward then, continuing the story. This place was born from the vision of a woman who understood that love multiplies when we share it. Our mother Sarah believed that every child deserves a chance to bloom, no matter how harsh their winter has been. Margaret wiped tears from her eyes as she listened. Grace stood beside her, nodding in quiet approval. Helen clutched a stack of programs to her chest, too moved to distribute them. Today, Lucy continued, we're opening more than just a medical facility. We're opening our hearts to possibility. Every child who comes here will find not just treatment, but acceptance, not just care, but love. As if on cue, dozens of butterflies rose from the nearby garden, their wings catching the sunlight like stained glass. The crowd gasped in delight. Look, Lucy pointed, her face glowing. They're dancing for us, just like in my dreams. Maxwell joined his daughters at the podium, drawing them both close. Sarah and Rachel would be so proud of you, he said softly, of all of us. After the ceremony, as people explored the grounds and medical staff gave tours of the facilities, Maxwell found himself back in Sarah's cottage. Everything was just as they had found it that day a year ago, but now her drawings and plans had been framed, creating a small museum of the foundation's origins. Grace appeared in the doorway. You've done well, she said simply. All of you. We couldn't have done it without you, Maxwell replied. You helped us see what was right in front of us all along. She smiled mysteriously. Sometimes we all need a little help remembering what love looks like. Outside, Lucy was leading her first official tour group, children and parents who would be starting treatment the following week. Her voice drifted through the window as she explained about the butterflies, the roses, the magic of healing. Emily stood at her office window in the medical wing, watching the scene below. She had finally found her true calling, combining her medical expertise with the nurturing spirit she had learned in this very garden. Margaret sat on Sarah's old bench, next to the angel statue. She held Rachel's diary in her lap, but her eyes were on her granddaughter, marveling at how life had come full circle. The Garden of Hope Foundation would go on to help thousands of children over the years. Its unique approach to healing would be studied and replicated around the world. But its greatest miracle had already occurred. The healing of one small family, brought together by a little girl who believed in magic and refused to let death have the final word. As the sun set on that first day, casting long shadows through the rose arbors, Lucy found her father standing by the fountain. Together they watched the butterflies dance among the flowers that Sarah had loved so much. "Are you happy, Daddy?" she asked, slipping her small hand into his. Maxwell looked at his daughter, this precious child who had saved his life in more ways than one. "More than I ever dreamed possible," he replied. And somewhere perhaps two mothers smiled down on the garden they had created, a place where love bloomed eternal, where healing began with hope, and where miracles happened every day in the simplest acts of kindness.